Do you have a promise from God, but fear is standing in your way? Do those obstacles seem too big and too scary? Find out today how to overcome your fear and claim your promise. Today on Refining Grace, where we study the Word of God to become refined, strengthened, and full of God's grace. The children of Israel were standing at the border of their promised land. God instructed Moses to send 12 spies into what is now known as Israel. These spies were composed of one leader from each of the 12 tribes. They were instructed to examine the land, the people, the cities, and the fruitfulness of the land. They did this. They found grapes and pomegranates and figs. They seen the people. They seen how the land was prosperous. And after 40 days, they came back. When they came back, their first words were, "It truly flows with milk and honey. This is its fruits." You find that in Numbers 13. One of the things that they were showing them was a cluster of grapes. One cluster. This cluster was so large that they had to cut it down. They got a pole, put the pole through the cluster, and 2 men had to carry it. That is a large cluster of grapes. The size of the grapes had to be humongous. The size of oranges or grapefruits or even larger for 2 men to have to carry it. You know, we see clusters of grapes and you get a cluster and it's about that big. It doesn't take a whole lot for one person to carry them. But this was so large that 2 men had to carry them with it being on a pole. So they seen how the promised land was prosperous. They seen the milk and honey, but they chose to look at the obstacles. This was the same people that God had delivered them from Egypt, delivered them without a fight. They had been sent out with gold and jewels. The same people who walked through the Red Sea on dry land. They had seen how God had parted it. The same people who had been guided here with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The same people who, when they didn't have food, God sent manna from above. When there was no water to be found, God brought water from a rock. When the Amalekites had attacked them, God delivered them when they shouldn't have been. But they thought this obstacle was too big. They were holding the blessings of God in their hands. They were holding those grapes and those figs and those pomegranates and everything else that they had brought from the promised land. But instead of looking at their promise, they looked at their fear. At least 10 of them did. There was 2 that stood up and said, "We are able." It says that when everybody was letting fear run them, Caleb quieted them down and says, "Let's go. We can take it. Our God's big enough. Let's go." But the other 10 said, "We're like grasshoppers in the sight of these giants. We have to be careful who we listen to." These 10 men were considered leaders in their tribes, but they weren't listening to the word of God. These 10 men had been given authority in their tribes, but they weren't standing in the authority of God. Just because someone speaks with authority does not mean that it's the authority of God. So be careful who you listen to, because God said go, and they said no. God had already proved who he was. He had already proved there's no obstacle too big. God knew about the giants. He had created them, and he's bigger than them. The giants were no bigger obstacle than Pharaoh's army, and they had already seen that army defeated. The people listened to the wrong report, and it's easy to fall into that same trap, to listen to the report when we allow fear to get a hold of us. Caleb and Joshua said, "Our God is able." Look what he's already done. In 2 Timothy 1:7, Paul told Timothy, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind." Fear that cripples keeps you from the things of God. It is not from God. When it talks about the fear of God being the beginning of all wisdom, it's a different kind of fear. That fear is a reverence. The fear that Paul talks about here is a crippling fear, and it's a fear that comes from hell. It's a fear that comes to stop us from what God has given us. Fear that keeps you from seeing God's promise is not from Him. Fear that keeps you up all night is not from Him. Only 2 of the 12 made it to the promised land. And most of the adults at that time also did not make it because they trusted in the fear instead of trusting in God. Caleb and Joshua looked to the promise of God. God said it was theirs, and they believed it was. It took 40 years for them to get their promise. They had to fight many battles. The 40 years was because of other people's unbelief, and God had to work that out of the young ones. But they got to claim their promise. In fact, Caleb was 80 when he made it to the promised land, and he chose the toughest mountain. He said, "Give me this mountain, the one with the giants." So don't listen to the bad report. Be careful whose report you believe. Make sure it lines up with the Word of God. When fear starts to rise, don't look at the fear. Concentrate on the promises of God. Concentrate on those good things of God. If you concentrate on the good things, that's what you're going to see. But if you concentrate on the fear, it will overcome you. So concentrate on God. Look to Him. Lift up your eyes into the hills, from whence cometh your help, because your help comes from the Lord. I pray that you got something out of this lesson. If you did, I ask that you would hit subscribe and like. And there's another video that'll be popping up here. May God bless you and keep you. May He make His face to shine upon you and give you peace.